This is the Danger Close podcast, Beyond the Books with me, Jack Carr.
Welcome to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by Sig Sauer. My guest today is Peter Bergen. Peter is one of the world's foremost experts on Osama Bin Laden, on al-Qaeda, on terrorism. He is CNN's national security analyst. He is a professor at Arizona State University's Center for the Future of War, and he is the author of the new book, The Rise and Fall of Osama Bin Laden, adding to his already lengthy resume of books he has authored on the subject of terrorism and Osama Bin Laden in particular. You can find out more about him at peterbergen.com. You can follow him on Twitter at peterbergencnn. And now, without further ado, Peter Bergen. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you for a little bit. And as you can tell, if you can see, I have all you're surrounded by all your books, as I have been for most of the last 20 years as they've come out. So thank you so much for. Oh, well, thank you so much for dedicating so much time, energy, and effort to this study and adding so much to our understanding of terrorism in general. Of course, al-Qaeda, Bin Laden. But I want to just jump right in here. And there's a couple of things. In 1983, I think you make a documentary in Pakistan about Afghan refugees escaping Soviet occupation. Then in 1993, I think you go to Afghanistan for the first time. 1997, you meet and interview Bin Laden. And then you travel to Pakistan in February of 2012 and are granted access to the compound where he's killed and go to that very room where friends of mine were that collected a lot of the documents that you use for your book. And shortly thereafter, it was destroyed. But before we get to all of that, 1983, like, are you 10 years old and you're making this documentary? Like, how are you doing a documentary in 1983?
Well, I think I was 19 or 20. Wow. I was a student at university and I had two friends and they said, let's go and make this film about the Afghan refugees. And of course, we had no idea what we were doing. And I'd never been to a country like Pakistan, and so, in a way, because we didn't know anything, it was actually good because we had no idea about what the problems would be. But we eventually, the film, we shot it on film, which shows how long ago this was. It was shot on 16 millimeter film. But that's what got me interested in the Afghan kind of story.
And what sparked that? Were you in university? Was it a class, or was it a documentary filmmaking class, or was it a foreign relations class, or what was it that sparked you guys to go do that?
There's two friends of mine, one of whom went on to become a pretty well-known producer, Barney Thompson, and another one, a friend of mine, George Case, and he made a lot of documentary films. So we had no, we weren't in a class. We just decided to do this, and we raised a little bit of money to go and do it, and we went and did it.
No kidding. And then 10 years later, that's the first time where you actually go into Afghanistan. And at this point, are you a producer for, is it CNN or BBC, or who are you working for at this point?
Yeah, then I'm working for CNN. So that was a whole different experience. In fact, I went with Peter Arnett, who at the time was the most famous correspondent in the world, because it was shortly after the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. And Peter Arnett, of course, had bravely decided to stay in Baghdad, despite a lot of people saying he should leave because it was dangerous. And so we went with two other colleagues into Afghanistan. And, for the younger listeners to this, when you went to Afghanistan in 93, you were gone. There was no...
You're not text messaging back. You're not posting Instagram photos.
Yeah, you were really gone. And you had no... And I took $60,000 in cash.
Wow.
On my person going in, back when, it's still a lot of money, but then it was like, because we had no idea what we were getting into. We knew it was going to be many, 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 many weeks. And we knew, there was no, you had to pay for everything in cash, and we knew. So we spent, it was the Civil War then was really, really bad. It was like Mogadishu in the 90s, very like block to block fighting in Kabul. And it was my first experience of seeing anything remotely like this. And, but the reason we went is the people who had bombed the Trade Center in February of 93 intended to bring it down. And many of them had actually trained in Afghanistan or had some link to the Afghan war. And it was the beginning of, our understanding. We were like trying to feel what was this elephant like, and of course we had no idea, but we knew there were these Arabs. We knew they were in Afghanistan. We knew that they were planning attacks elsewhere. We knew they'd attacked in the United States. We didn't know what the organization was. We didn't know who the leadership was. And that's kind of what got me interested in bin Laden, because 3 years after making that film, the State Department released a really quite useful 2-page white paper about bin Laden publicly. And I thought to myself, well, maybe since the attack on the Trade Center in '93 was pretty organized and organizations have leaders, maybe he is the leader.
And then you go back again. So this is 97 now. We jump ahead here. Yeah. But I guess in that 93 one, was that one of the most dangerous times for you as a journalist on the ground because of the unknown? Or did you, I guess, what was the closest call in all these times you've been to Pakistan and Afghanistan? And I'll ask you specifically about getting to bin Laden, which you talk about in this book, and you talk about in Manhunt, and just getting to him. It seemed like it was there were a lot of unknowns there, especially knowing what we know post 9/11 about some things that have happened to journalists. But what was the most, I guess, the sketchiest, or the time when you were the most worried about security?
The sketchiest was definitely 93, because the war, it was a very, very, very intense civil war. It wasn't like the war. There've been civil wars in Afghanistan for 43 years now, even before the Soviets invaded. But this was, there were no front lines. You didn't know where they were. Everybody was heavily armed. The prime minister at the time was shelling his own capital on a daily basis, which is kind of a first. Gulbuddin Hikmatcher, he's still around. So you really had no idea. And also, I was completely inexperienced. I was with people who had a lot of combat experience as journalists. So they knew what they were doing. I didn't know what I was doing. And since after 9/11, I embedded like multiple times. And, sometimes that's really very boring because there's just nothing happening. And sometimes that's, it's less boring. But I think 93 was the time where it was the most dangerous, because it was also like it wasn't really clear what was going on. Not that it's ever very clear in a battle situation, but it was very unclear. And I don't claim it was like spectacularly dangerous, but because the other thing, of course, is like it's only really dangerous when you get yourself into a situation where it becomes very dangerous, and that is kind of the luck of the draw, as you know.
Yep. Yep. And then in 97 though, you go back, and how do you're still, you're not brand new at CNN, but you're still, you're a producer still at this point. You're still traveling with Peter Arnett, who, for those listening, got the Pulitzer back in Vietnam days. So he'd been around for a while. So you had quite the mentor at that point. And how do you make contact with bin Laden and his organization? I think it's someone in London or Great Britain that you reach out to that's a spokesperson or a PR person in 96. And then finally in March of 97, you actually get there. But how did that process from when you first met, how did you make contact, first of all? And then how did it lead you into Afghanistan in March of 97?
Well, making contact, bin Laden had a kind of above ground PR guy who actually turned out to be, according to the US government, a member of al-Qaeda. He's now serving a life sentence in US prison. And so I called the CNN London bureau, and they had his number, and I called him and went to have tea with him, and hung out with him. And then I hung out with a variety of bin Laden associates and colleagues, some people who really knew him pretty well, some people who knew him sort of peripherally. They were all based in London, because at the time, Karl Marx is buried in Highgate Cemetery. So, the English, UK has had a long and honorable tradition of like housing dissidents. And some of these people were real dissidents, and some were really members of al-Qaeda, but I didn't even know that al-Qaeda existed at the time. And one of them, a guy called Abu Musab al-Suri, presented himself as kind of a journalist who covered these conflicts and was, basically an Islamist. And many years later, I found out he was kind of a made man in al-Qaeda. He was very close to bin Laden, but he didn't say any of that at the time. So he and a colleague of his took us, and us was Peter Arnett, myself, and the cameraman, Peter Juvenal, who'd also he'd gone into Afghanistan 75 times under the Soviets. So which is like talk about risk. The Soviets had total air superiority until 1986. They inflicted a really totalitarian war on the population. So Peter had, and he was a former British Army officer, and he had considerable experience. So I went with two people who really knew what they were doing.
Got it.
But actually, Taliban controlled Afghanistan in '97 wasn't especially dangerous because the Taliban, their claim, the reason that they were able to kind of take over, essentially, they killed the opposition, not necessarily by fighting, but it kind of a little bit with what they did this time around, which is they seemed like an unstoppable force. And Afghans, it's not that they're cowards; it's that there's been multiple changes of regimes in like the last 40 years, and most Afghans want to retain their heads on their shoulders. And so if they see that there is an unstoppable force, whether that's the United States after 9/11, or the Taliban in '96, or the Taliban in 2021, they're going to surrender, or they're going to make an accommodation. So the Taliban controlled Afghanistan when I was there in '97 was safe, but it was safe at a tremendous cost. In fact, I remember talking to some pilots, Afghan pilots at the hotel. We were staying at a 0-star hotel in eastern Afghanistan, and there were a couple of pilots there, and I engaged them in conversation. I said, it is safe because one of the principles, it had been very anarchic in that civil war period. And they said, yeah, it's safe, but it comes at a price. It's like being in a prison. And I, for a lot of Afghans, that was the experience. And, Afghanistan under the Taliban, one of the reasons I'm very skeptical about the Taliban, and probably anybody listening to this now has seen enough of what they've done when they're back in power to be skeptical, is I spent some time there when they were in power, and the population of Kabul went down to 500,000, the capital city. The population today is, no one really knows, but it's 5 million or 6 million. The Taliban really kind of pulled the country back to the Middle Ages to the best of their ability. They didn't really have a plan to govern. And, they were very incompetent, and they were also pretty brutal. So, they're not the Nazis by any stretch, but they certainly, what they've done. What they do. So anyway, but that's all a long way of saying that, the war was over by the time we met Bin Laden in '97.
But it was still, and you talk about it in Manhunt. And for those who haven't seen it, the HBO documentary, and it's on Apple TV now. You can go and search for it under Manhunt. You actually retrace those steps, which is pretty cool. And you get in because you're blindfolded, you're given some glasses, and you get into a van with curtains on the windows, and you're driven to some place, and then you go and you have this interview, which I've watched in its entirety, and it's fascinating to watch today. Obviously, knowing what we know now, and you talk about it in Holy War Inc. and in Manhunt. And what was that like? What was that feeling like? Was that the first time you'd been blindfolded to go to an interview? And then once you're there in this cave, were you worried about being beheaded back then, or was this just kind of the what you did in that part of the world if you wanted to interview with someone like this?
I was tremendously excited, to be honest. We were not allowed to film any of this, and obviously, it was like,
it was filmed by their cameras. It was by Bin Laden's cameras, right?
We couldn't film any of the, like, what was happening to us, how we got there, all that. It was very, of course, it was exciting. At the time, I was not worried because A, they'd invited us, and B, this is before they killed Danny Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter who al-Qaeda essentially kidnapped and murdered in January of 2002, and then sort of the rules of the game changed. It's going to be hard for younger people who are listening to this to remember that there was a time when journalists, aid workers, and priests, nuns, people were really treated in wartime as kind of, they were non-combatants. And so if you were an aid worker, you didn't have to worry about being kidnapped, or if you were a journalist, you didn't have to be worried about being kidnapped or shot at or whatever. But those rules kind of changed, and obviously the ISIS made it even worse. But so I wasn't concerned about them doing anything to us. It was their first television interview, so it would sort of be weird to then sort of do something to us. Clearly, they were very concerned about, did we have a tracking device? And if they found one on us, I think they would have definitely, that would have been very bad news for us. But we didn't have one, and the interview proceeded, and he was very low key, and he declared war on the United States. So it was the first time he'd done so to a kind of Western audience. It was his first TV interview. He spoke in Arabic, even though he speaks English, because he wanted to be very precise about what he was saying. in his native language, and people around him treated him with a lot of respect, and they kind of called him the Sheikh, and they hung on his every word. And he delivered this interview, and we it was the middle of this, probably 3 o'clock in the morning by the time he left, and we went back to our hotel and went back to the United States, and we edited the interview, and it went out, I think, on some early May 1997, and it kind of just went out, and it just landed with a thud, because no one knew what to make of it, because
Right.
it was sort of, he hadn't done anything yet.
Mhm.
And there were people at the U.S. government who were interested in him, but it was a very small group.
Yeah, I want to ask you about them later. It's a
Yeah.
fascinating cast of characters, and you talk to a lot of them in the Manhunt documentary, and you talk about a lot of them in this book as well. So, did you realize, even though that the interview didn't, he hadn't done the East Africa embassy bombings yet, there was no Cole yet, obviously there's no 9/11 yet. Did you realize what you had and who you had been talking to, and what his capabilities were going forward? Because wasn't it the first time that he on television really declares war against the West? And so, did it sink in how significant he was as a person, and the movement he led, how much of an impact that was going to have on the future, or what? Or did you just go on to the next assignment?
No, I mean, I thought it was, look, I put a lot of effort into making this happen, and we had put a lot of effort. My colleagues, CNN, my bosses at CNN, who I must credit, Pam Hill and the late John Lane. We went in '93, and they gave, it was very expensive, and it was very lengthy, and it was very uncertain about what was going to happen. And we made this documentary, and then I went back to them in '97. I said, "There's a guy, Bin Laden. I think he's behind the Trade Center attack in '93." And they didn't know who Bin Laden was, but they had a lot of faith in me and us and the process. They let us go and do it, so to their credit. But because he had actually done some things, but we weren't aware of them, and
Mhm.
he actually mentioned them in the interview, and I didn't even know what he was talking about. At one point, he talked about this victory in Aden. Now, years later, I kind of worked out what he meant, which is his guys had bombed 2 hotels in Yemen, in Aden, which were housing American servicemen who were on their way to Somalia. The bombs had killed a tourist. No American servicemen were killed. We didn't know that had happened,
Mhm.
but
Right.
he mentioned it in the interview. So now I was puzzled by this reference for a while. But so that's all by way of saying, he made all these threats, but it wasn't clear to us that he was going to do anything about it. It was only, pretty much a year later, August 7th, 1988, when he blew up 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, and then it was clear to anybody that he was a real problem, because not only did he killed 212 civilians. He had no compunction about it. There was no warning. A number of them were Muslims, because Kenya and Tanzania, where the bombs went off, have big Muslim populations. He killed 12 Americans and 200 Africans. He didn't have any problem about it at all. And usually, it's interesting thing about terrorists in the past is that they try to avoid, these mass casualty attacks, because they could backfire, lead to a crackdown. You might lose your support, any support you might have. And Bin Laden just didn't care about any of that. So that from that point forward, it was clear that he was a serious problem. But even then, because he hadn't attacked in the United States, a lot of, once the Clinton administration responded, the Bush administration came in, they were they just didn't see Bin Laden as a big deal. And, which is strange, because, we now,
Yeah,
there was
there's
a
a
guy called
growing body of evidence for sure that you cover
yeah,
in this
yeah,
book, and your other ones for sure. And
yeah,
that's what I'm hoping that, I mean, everybody should read this book. It's just fascinating, especially where we are now at this next turning point, essentially in the history of our United States relationship with Afghanistan. So bringing an understanding of that based on all your years of study is so vital. So and what was interesting to me is when you point out that up till that point in these different waves of terrorism, when we talk about it as a tactic, that for the most part, they wanted a ton of eyeballs on these events, but not the mass casualty part for those reasons that you
right,
just mentioned. And then Obama and
yeah,
Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, they changed that dynamic, and they want mass casualties. and the eyeballs on the screen at the same time that Al Jazeera is giving essentially him a platform, free internet days, because they're coming to prominence. They're just coming on the scene in the mid 90s, essentially at the same time that he's rising to prominence. And
Yep.
then, of course, now we have 24-hour news. And then, of course, when we have the rise of social media and the internet after all that, and all this kind of comes together to allow you to have both mass casualty events and more eyeballs than were ever possible in the history of the world at this time. So it's an incredible
That is
dynamic.
correct. And in today's world, they wouldn't have sought an interview with CNN. Again, for younger people, CNN was the Twitter of the day, which is seems so old school now, but at the time it was the most advanced media technology. And now, of course, like somebody like Bin Laden is just using Twitter or whatever social media platform doesn't have to engage with the traditional media, and and of course the barriers to entry for social media are zero, right? So, yeah, I think your point. I mean, the point is that these groups will exploit whatever the latest media technology is, because they do want to advertise what they're doing and their message.
Yeah, but even back in the 80s, there was this magazine Jihad that I think you go and you buy a bunch of them in Afghanistan or in Pakistan or somewhere that you probably still have today, I'm guessing. But I mean, that's once again earlier, even before the 24-hour news cycle days that CNN kicked off. You have Jihad magazine, and you have them doing profiles essentially of Bin Laden, and there's one. Well, before I get to the battle that you talk about in the book as really one of the pivotal points in Bin Laden's history with the Soviets, you ask early in the book something else here, and of course, Bin Laden is one of those people who has changed the course of history. 9/11 being a seminal moment in the history of the United States and the world. But you ask this question early in the book, and you say the key question about Bin Laden is, why did he build an organization dedicated to the mass murder of civilians? And you come to the conclusion that it was a gradual process of radicalization rather than a single moment, like a bomb killing parents or something like that radicalizes you. But it was a gradual process of radicalization. And can you talk about that in terms of your understanding of him as a person becoming this radicalized individual that changed the course of history?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question, because it's kind of the main question I'm trying to answer. And like there's with all these why questions, there's no super simple answer. And so what I do is kind of explain more like how this became the case rather than why. I don't do a lot of armchair psychologizing. Okay, so his parents divorced when he was 2. That truly had an effect on him. His mother was one of more than 20 wives that his dad had. His dad had 54 other kids. He was kind of a marginal figure in the family because his mother was an Alawite, which is a form of Shiism, which is regarded as heretical certainly by Orthodox Sunni Muslims living in Saudi Arabia. So his mother is comes from Syria. She's kind of marginal. Bin Laden himself describes her as a concubine, which is kind of two Spanish girls that he meets when he's a teenager, when he's sort of describing his family background. So, I think he's kind of a little bit of an outsider in his own family. His father dies in a plane crash when he's 10. By his own account, this has a profound effect on him. He turns to religion. He memorizes the Quran. By the time he's a teenager, he's a very religious teenager. He's chanting about Palestine with his buddies and fasting twice a week, praying and getting up in the middle of the night to pray. So he's a very religious teenager. Marries when he's 17. Starts having his family. Soviets invade, obviously a big moment for Bin Laden. He starts going to Pakistan to help the Afghan resistance for the first 5 years. Then he goes into Afghanistan in 84. It's a pretty dangerous battlefield. 3 years later, he sets up his own military base, which is called the base, al-Qaeda in Arabic. It's very close to a Soviet military outpost. Now, nobody with any military training would set up their own base next to a Soviet military post. It's a guerrilla war, so you don't set up kind of fixed positions. But Bin Laden wanted to, in his own words, draw enemy fire. He was recruiting people who wanted to die, to be martyred. They were idealistic Saudi university students. And Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered by Saudi officials in Istanbul in 2018, in 1998, does the first major profile of Bin Laden at this base in Afghanistan. And it's a true portrait of Bin Laden setting up this base with a bunch of courageous, idealistic young guys who are fighting the Soviets. And then Bin Laden, the war ends in '89. Bin Laden sort of casting around for what to do. He flirts with the idea of trying to attack the socialist government in Yemen, in southern Yemen. He flirts with the idea of trying to overthrow the communist government in Afghanistan, which has replaced the Soviets. Neither of those happen. And then the Americans, come into Saudi Arabia because of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And he's always been anti-American because of its support for Israel, but that really turns him against the United States. He he offers his men famously to fight Saddam. That offer is laughed at, rightly so. Saddam had the fourth largest army in the world at the time, and had just fought a 10-year war with the Iranians. So they knew what they were doing to some degree. So and then Bin Laden's in exile in Sudan. That's when he starts plotting against the United States. He gets re-exiled from Sudan to Afghanistan. Within a week of being in Afghanistan, he declares war in a kind of very serious way against the United States. So it's that process that book tracks. And one of the things, I've done books about I did a book called United States of Jihad about Americans who kind of become jihadists. Yeah. And I think you've got it there.
Yeah, right here. Boom, there it is. Yeah. Got them all.
I looked at a lot of these cases, and why do Americans join al-Qaeda? I mean, it's a puzzle, right? There's a variety of reasons, and it can be a death of a parent, it can be feeling that Muslims are under attack, it can be losing a job, it can be a friend who kind of accesses this, and you don't go all the way down the path of radicalization necessarily to violence. You may just become a fundamentalist, and that's it. But it's a very individual set of decisions, and the more you dig into it, it's not like there's some easy answer for all this. And in Bin Laden's case, you could say his father died early, his parents divorced when he was a kid. But the interesting thing is, he had 54 siblings who presumably had much of his same life experience, maybe not exactly, and none of them went down the path he chose. So it was. What I try and say in the book is that none of this was inevitable. There were people who tried to intervene. His family tried to intervene. His friends tried to intervene. His associates tried to intervene. Jamal Khashoggi, who I've just mentioned, visited him in Sudan and tried to kind of say, hey, try and make peace with the Saudis and give me an interview in which he renounced violence. And he seemed to be interested in that opportunity, but he didn't take it. So it was a gradual process. There were various off ramps he could have taken, but he chose not.
I found those fascinating in the book, the off ramps, particularly some of those random events that happened that may have been able to change quite possibly the course of history. One being his older brother dying in an airplane accident in Texas, I believe, who was someone he looked up to that possibly could have intervened or maybe taken him on a different path, perhaps. But I found those were fascinating. But going back to 1987, or really 1986, when he starts to build these caves and he brings in equipment through his construction company that he had a stake in and was more actively involved in back then, and they start using backhoes and digging these trenches and all that stuff, essentially setting up for to draw the Soviets into a battle. It seemed like anyway, and it's the Battle of Jaji. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yeah. But so they have this battle, and it was surprising to me, but I have to put myself back in 1987 and remember the technology and everything that was going on, is that they start this construction project, I think in the fall of 1986. The battle doesn't happen until 1987. And I'm thinking that's a lot of time that the Soviets allowed them to build up these caves and trenches and all that stuff. So that stood out to me. But what also stood out to me is what a PR victory it was. Public relations victory for him, and that it could draw in new recruits. It kind of elevated him to war hero status because he got some legitimate press, not just in Jihad magazine, but in the larger press at the time. And that gave him that kind of opened the aperture for him, it seemed, a little bit, and just elevating his status. So I think that was a seminal moment. And then he also, in his own mind, it seems in the book, you talk about how he would mention quite not infrequently that this battle, it took the Soviets, defeated the Soviets, and pushed them out of Afghanistan, which it obviously did not do. But he got to thinking, maybe he told himself that so many times without looking at just the data and the numbers and all the rest of it, that maybe he did actually push the Soviets out of Afghanistan. So
Yeah,
that seemed like a turning point in his
I think
history.
was a turning point. I mean, because it was really, he. I think at the time there were 6,000 Saudi princes. None of them had any record of going to Afghanistan, even though there was like a totally justified holy war. Here's a non-Muslim force invading a Muslim country. From a point of view of Islamic kind of theology, this was a very justified jihad, and of course, it was one the United States supported. But yeah, I think the experience of being in battle himself, the picture you get of him in his 20s, he was shy to the point of almost saying nothing when he in meetings. He would say very little. And people found him to be very modest and very retiring. So I think leading men into battle and fighting the Soviets himself, I mean, that definitely changed him. And he suddenly thought, okay, I've got this organization, which they kind of nicknamed al-Qaeda because it was the base. And they were at this base, and that nickname kind of stuck and then became the name of the group. And from that point forward, by the time he founds al-Qaeda, he's 31. So he's a fully formed adult. And I think by then he really believed in himself and believed some of the things, Jack, that you just said, which is that he had a personal role in defeating the Soviets. And there's no denying that he fought bravely against the Soviets, but the idea that his guys had any meaningful impact on the war was one of many delusions he had. Because, one thing the Afghans don't need a lot of help with is fighting. And there were 175,000 Afghans on the battlefield at any given moment. That's the low end estimate during the war against the Soviets. There were maybe 300 followers of Bin Laden on the battlefield, and that's the high end estimate. So, I mean, there's just no way that these guys had any real impact on the war.
Now, we heard after 9/11 and continued to hear for quite some time that Bin Laden he was just a financier. He didn't really do anything. Maybe he was there, but he didn't really do much. And that doesn't seem to be the case. And in your research, did you think that, and it was reported by a lot of different news organizations over the years, was that intentional misinformation by our intelligence services, or was that just kind of the understanding because people threw around this financier type of a moniker that seemed to fit with other people with money in the Middle East? How did that come about?
I think it's the latter, because when the agency first started, CIA first started kind of looking at Bin Laden, they were looking at the money issue, and that's how they conceive of Bin Laden, as a financier, and that's not wrong, but it wasn't the whole picture, and so yeah, I just think it was, and I think kind of a case of mirror imaging, which is you don't want to do if you're an intelligence analyst, which is to kind of think the whole world functions just like we do. Well, I think there was a kind of assumption that at one point the common number that people wrote about was $300 million that Bin Laden had in his bank account. Well, it turns out, and Steve Cole, my former colleague where I work at New America and now dean of Columbia Journalism School, he really did a forensic examination of what Bin Laden inherited, and it was just under 20 million, which was not dissimilar to a figure that I'd heard when I was first reporting on this. And so 20 million is it's not a small amount of money. It's not 300 million, and you can't really count for at the end of the day, the 9/11 hijackers weren't motivated by money. You can't get people to commit suicide on your behalf by giving them money. That's not going to work. So there was a set of ideas that Bin Laden had. He did fight against the Soviets. The idea that he didn't is simply not true.
Yeah. And it's interesting how you talk about that money. We heard, you hear Saudi billionaire family, and then you just assume all this money, but really that slice of the inheritance was fairly small. And then there was a stake in the company that I think was eventually frozen along the way, or he didn't have access to once he's expelled from Saudi Arabia, perhaps, or however that came about. But over time, he had less and less access to any of that money and was on the verge of bankruptcy multiple times.
Yeah. And at a certain point, he just ran out of money. I mean, and his personal money was all frozen in Sudan. It seems that, according to some of the documents that were found in the about his son was able to go to Sudan and kind of recoup like
Mm.
a couple of $1 million of the $29 million Bin Laden said he put in. But I think at the end, when the money that was then financing al-Qaeda was, people would come to Afghanistan with donations. The people would come to Afghanistan to join, and they'd bring their own, small amounts of money, and it kind of was sort of self-financing by either people in the Gulf who kind of sympathized, or some of the the people who joined bought their own resources, and of course Taliban controlled Afghanistan before 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a hugely expensive place to operate in.
Right. And so, I mean, you've written so much about Bin Laden, about al-Qaeda, terrorism. So in 2011, 2012, obviously you get, there's some more access. The Trump administration releases a bunch of documents from Abbottabad compound that my friends helped gather up, which is crazy that they did that. And we're talking on this podcast now, but there's like something like 70,000 files, I think, and 6,000 pages of useful information that are private letters to his wife, to his kids, some other leaders of al-Qaeda and other jihadi groups. But what surprised you the most sifting through all those documents to write your latest book? What was the biggest surprise? What's that?
Good job that your friends picked up these documents, because they're extremely helpful, not just to people like myself, but obviously to the CIA and others. And I think there was, Amon McRaven, basically he wanted to have it finished at 30 minutes, and it took 48 minutes. And in that 80 minutes, the SEALs there picked up like 100 storage devices and thumb drives and 5 computers, and so there were 470,000 files. Some of them were not useful, because Bin Laden would make multiple. He'd edit a document 50 times. His kids were watching cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of sort of material that wasn't, but there was 6,000 pages of useful material. And the stuff that is surprising, I think there are 3 or 4 things that are sort of surprising. One, the extent to which his 2 oldest wives were advising him. I knew that they'd have PhDs. One, his oldest wife was 62 when Bin Laden was 54 when he was killed, and she was 62. She'd had an independent career in Saudi Arabia. She had a PhD in child psychology. She claimed descent from Prophet Muhammad. And then he had another wife, his same age, 54. She had a PhD in Quranic grammar. She was also a poet, and she edited his writings. So I kind of knew some of that. But what I didn't know was that they were really part of his kitchen cabinet. Every night they would gather in the dining room, in the kitchen, and talk about like how he should respond to the events of the Arab Spring, which was, in Bin Laden's view, the most important event in the Middle East in centuries. But his views, his followers were absent, at least in the beginning. And so they all knew this was a problem. And so Bin Laden was, it turned out, highly reliant on his 2 highly educated wives to help him do his thinking for him, to help him edit his speeches. And I think that was surprising. That was surprise number 1. Surprise number 2 from these documents is the 2 bodyguards who have been essential. They've been with him for a decade, since 9/11. Were about to leave him, and he wasn't paying them very much. He was paying them $100 a month, which turned out to be, they were concerned that it was very dangerous to be looking after the world's most dangerous man. They had reason to be concerned because both of them were killed, and one of their wives were killed on the night of the raid. But they were planning to leave Bin Laden, and this was a big problem for him, because when they left, they were his. I mean, it's not just that they went out and, like, if he needed a particular book or newspaper or whatever, I mean, they would go and get it. But they were also delivering all the messages to the other leaders of al-Qaeda, and they were the one link to the outside world, and they were protecting him. And they also, the house that he constructed in Abbottabad, which was really purpose-built to kind of disguise the fact it was there, it was not in his name, it was in the bodyguard's name. So one of the surprising letters and all this stuff that was recovered was, on January 15, 2011, Bin Laden wrote his 2 bodyguards a note saying, essentially, last time we met, everybody was so angry that I'm writing you a letter to kind of memorialize what we agreed. So bear in mind that these bodyguards were living just a few yards away from him. So, it's not often that you pen a letter to people you're kind of living with to kind of get in writing kind of what you agree to. So Bin Laden wrote, we've agreed that I need to find a new protector, and I basically got 6 months. which actually makes Obama's decision to kind of pull the trigger on the raid at the end of April, even it was a smart decision. But because one of the things that Obama was worried about the night of, as he made the decision, he was in the treaty room in the White House, which is in the residential quarters. And one of the things he was concerned about is what if Bin Laden decides to leave? It wasn't clear if it was Bin Laden there or not, but let's say it was, he could leave. And in fact, it turns out that he was planning to leave as early as July of 2011, not because he wanted to, but because the bodyguards were abandoning him. So that was another concern in these documents. Another concern was, he hadn't attacked the United States. He was very annoyed about that. He was kind of pressing his people to kill President Obama, try and kill Vice President Biden, try and kill General Petraeus, all of which was sort of delusional because they had no capacity to do those sorts of things. And then he was also very concerned about the fact that al-Qaeda's affiliates were killing so many Muslim civilians, which kind of was a change of heart for him because he began to care more and more about the issue. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, as you know, killed so many Muslim civilians. This was really a big issue. Al-Qaeda positioned itself as a defender of Muslims. Here, its affiliate had killed probably tens of thousands of Iraqis and a lot of Pakistanis and Afghans. And so there was a concern. So he was thinking about rebranding Al-Qaeda to be more careful about this issue of killing Muslim civilians. So he had a lot of things that he was worried about in the last weeks of his life. And, the documents, by the way, are all publicly out there. The document that was the most useful to me hasn't been translated into English. And this was a family diary, 226 pages in length. It's handwritten in Arabic. I got Nadia Wadad, who's a well-known scholar of Islamism, helped me kind of decipher it because it wasn't intended for public consumption. It's handwritten. It's it's like if you kept your own diary, you write it in shorthand of various kinds of ways. So, but this diary really kind of gives a window into what Bin Laden was worried about in these final weeks. And the big thing he was worried about was how to respond to the Arab Spring, what to say, how to kind of try and make himself relevant again. Because he knew that he was, and his family also knew, like if he didn't come out there with a statement, people would think he was irrelevant. And of course, he penned a statement, and it was released after his death. It really made no difference.
Right. That's so fascinating. And I think one of your books is found in his library in Abbottabad as well.
Yeah, he had the audio version of the Osama Bin Laden I Know. And so, who knows?
What did that feel like?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, but he also had a bunch of reports by Rand. He had congressional testimony, I testified in. I mean, he was very interested in what the West was saying about him. I mean, I don't know if it was was it curiosity or ego or both? I don't know, but he had a whole library of books, including by Mike Scheuer, who ran the CIA unit dedicated to hunting down Bin Laden, and books by Bob Woodward, and he had quite a library of books. They weren't necessarily physical library. His couriers were bringing him thumb drives, and he would have PDFs of stuff he was interested in, and they would give it to him.
Interesting. And then in all this research, a lot of people talk about without evidence really other than maybe circumstantial or just by looking at a map about ISI or the Pakistanis knowing that he was living there in Abbottabad. And you dispel some of that in the book, saying, hey, there's no direct link to any of that. But what were your thoughts on that connection of him living there and of Pakistan? But I think you point to the fact that there's not just silence about it, but there is actual surprise in some of the collection done from senior level people in ISI and Pakistani military that they didn't know we were going to see.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to everybody in the Obama administration at any level of seniority, and of course, it was all tightly held. But I pretty much have talked to everybody who was there, and you used the word surprise on the night of the operation. Like they could tell the Pakistanis had no idea what was happening. They really didn't know what was happening. It wasn't that they were pretending to. They were surprised. And in fact, one of the really interesting documents I used was there was a pretty good Pakistani government investigation by 4 independent retired civil servants, whatever. And it's a very critical investigation. They talked to a lot of the folks involved, and they talked to the wives of Bin Laden. one of his two adult daughters. And so one of the takeaway from that is that Pakistanis had no idea he was there. And then if you look at all the documents, and it's hard to prove negatives, there's nothing in the documents. Look, if I was living for 5.5 years in a particular place and I had a Pakistani official who was kind of my controller or the guy who knew where I was, I mean, you'd expect some sort of communications with that person. There's nothing of that kind. And it turns out that Bin Laden was hiding from people on the compound. Forget about he was being very careful. One of the bodyguards' wives didn't know it was Bin Laden who was living there, and so he was going to great lengths. And I don't think most of the people, senior people in al-Qaeda, didn't know where Bin Laden was. They would just get a letter. It's not like he would sort of hear my geographical coordinates at the end of the letter. He was being super, 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 super careful. And when people say to me, well, surely they must have known, I sometimes refer to Whitey Bulger. Whitey Bulger killed 20 people in Boston. He was the subject of a very intense FBI manhunt, which went on for, I think he disappeared in 1999. It took almost 2 decades to find him, and he was living in California. So the point is that people look at this terrible person who was seemingly killed his girlfriend, who's disappeared into this nature reserve, or we don't really know. And I mean, the huge amount of law enforcement efforts being put on finding this person. So that's in our own country where we have considerable resources. And so the fact that Bin Laden disappeared, and what did him in the end was he wanted to remain in charge of al-Qaeda, and he did that by communicating by courier with the leaders of al-Qaeda, and he was trying to micromanage the group, not necessarily that successfully all the time, but if he'd just sort of if he'd said nothing, never written a letter to anybody, I think he might still be alive. But he did want to remain in control, and he sent these long memos to his leadership to kind of try and retain control. But it was like running a business in the 19th century, where you don't have a telephone, or you don't have the internet, you don't even have a telegraph. It was a hard way to kind of keep control, but he did. Sometimes messages get lost, or the people would take a long time to reply, or pretend they didn't get the message, or who knows. But often people would get these messages in places like Somalia, and they pay attention to them. So I mean, it's kind of amazing. Bin Laden sitting in a Abbottabad of Somalia is many thousands of miles away. So he was sending letters to al-Shabaab, these Somali terrorist group, and he told them, for instance, don't change your name to al-Qaeda. Be bad for fundraising. Keep it on the QT, on the down low, and and they agreed, and they didn't change their name. They didn't identify themselves with al-Qaeda while Bin Laden was alive. So he did retain. It's kind of a strange mixed message, because people have sort of said, well, people look at these documents and say, well, Bin Laden was still really in control. Or people look at these documents and say, Bin Laden was delusional and he a micromanager, but not very successful. And I think both of those things are true. He was, some of his groups, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they basically ignored what he was saying. He and the leadership of Al-Qaeda were saying, stop executing people publicly and stop attacking the Shia. But, Al-Qaeda in Iraq essentially ignored that. But other groups paid attention.
Interesting. And then al-Zawahiri, your understanding of him has morphed over the years, from when you wrote Holy War Inc. that I think came out in August of 2001, right before September 11th, and then I think a reprint afterward with some other notes in there. But I think your understanding of him and his influence on the organization has morphed along with the rest of the public's, because I don't know where it started with him, with Bin Laden as a puppet, if that was misinformation on our side of the house intentionally, or is it just the visual of him being right next to Bin Laden in some photos that people could say, oh, look, there's the real brains, the quiet one sitting next to him. But really, he was kind of a marginal figure and not a very good leader that we have a lot of evidence to point to now.
Well, thanks for picking up on that, because I think that, I think you're right. The visual, because Zawahiri was always sitting next to Bin Laden after 9/11 in the visual. So therefore he must have been important. He was, when Bin Laden gave his first and only press conference, Zawahiri was sitting next to Bin Laden in 98. But but as I've dug into it, Zawahiri was a very marginal figure, and Bin Laden didn't really consult him in any meaningful way on any of the big attacks. Didn't clue him in about 9/11 until very late in the game. Attacking the United States was not Zawahiri's interest. He really wanted regime change in Egypt, which Bin Laden could care less about. So that's one of the takeaways. We've seen that Zawahiri is a very weak leader. He may, by all accounts, he may be in poor health. We don't really know, but he's done nothing to resurrect this organization. And in fact, as you know, Al Qaeda and ISIS split very publicly in 2014 when ISIS kind of created itself. I think Bin Laden might have been able to kind of keep everything together. Of course, he didn't want to attack the Shia, which is what ISIS is very much directed at. But Bin Laden had so much more stature than Zawahiri, and was widely respected and liked by these jihadi groups. Zawahiri is a kind of cantankerous, boring, anti-charismatic guy. But he may well die of ill health or in a drone strike. And there is somebody else in the wing, Saif al-Adil, who's a former Egyptian special forces officer, who's been living in Iran for quite a long period of time. He may be back in Afghanistan already. He would be potentially pretty good leader of al-Qaeda. And of course, jumping forward to today, we have this extraordinary situation where Siraj Haqqani, who's the leader of one of the deputy leader of the Taliban, is now the Minister of Interior of the Taliban, which is like running DHS and the FBI simultaneously.
With a price on his head, right? Two different prices, I think.
Two different prices. You're very well noticed. I mean,
10 million from one, 5 million from another department. I mean,
from the State Department and 5 from the FBI, and I was like, I asked if somebody in the FBI why the difference, and they were like, well, State Department has more money for the program. But the point is and the UN identifies Siraj Haqqani as they think he's on the leadership council of Al-Qaeda. So this is really kind of amazing sort of history repeating itself type situation, except arguably worse, with the big difference that, of course, the United States is much better defended than it was on 9/11. Their ability to carry out an attack from the United States is so much lower because for so many different reasons. I mean, look, just think about TSA, which didn't exist on 9/11, or National Counter-Terrorism Center, Department of Homeland Security. We're much, much better defended. But what we're not defended against is Americans kind of radicalizing in front of their computers. And I sort of think that it's not impossible that the Taliban victory will energize, just like ISIS's victory could energize people in the United States who don't go and train with ISIS or with jihadi groups in Afghanistan, but just get excited by what's going on in Afghanistan and may take matters in their own hands. So unfortunately, if we had this conversation a year ago, I wouldn't be saying. I mean, we're at another iteration of this. Let's see how bad it could be. I mean, I don't think it's not going to be 9/11 again or anything close, but it certainly could be ISIS summer of 2014, which they trained. There was an attack in Paris that killed 130 people with ISIS trainees. There was an attack in Brussels that killed dozens. There was an attack in ISIS certainly trained people for attacks in the West with some success. They never trained any Americans to carry out attacks, but they did inspire attacks in the United States, in Orlando and San Bernardino. Right. So I don't think it's going to be exactly the same. Afghanistan is harder to get to than Syria and Iraq, but I think there's going to be more similarities than differences. And the Taliban, there's nothing the Taliban have done so far that sort of convinced me that they are, significantly different than they were before 9/11.
There's certainly a lot of indicators that point to history rhyming at the very least. Yeah. But going back to Zawahiri quickly and his involvement in knowing about 9/11 and that sort of thing. Well, first, before we get there, where were you on 9/11, and did you know immediately Al-Qaeda?
Well, I did, because you mentioned my first book. In fact, I finished it 10 days before 9/11, and like any first book, it had a lot of problems, and I didn't. And I'd also framed it as a travel log, and because no one really was that interested in the subject, and suddenly I had to reframe it completely because it's been this massive tragedy. And then, of course, so I was going into CNN because Ahmad Shah Massoud had just been assassinated by Al-Qaeda. Now, I didn't know it was by Al-Qaeda. I knew that he'd been killed. And the Northern Alliance, which was his group, was trying to kind of keep it quiet. They knew that Massoud's death would be very bad for their morale. And so I was going into to CNN to talk about this fact, and then the 9/11 attacks happened. So, I knew immediately. If anybody I mean, you didn't need any special knowledge. And in fact, I'd written a 4-page letter to the New York Times to their main foreign correspondent, John Bergens, on August the 14th. And I wrote him a 4-page letter saying, here's what I think there's an attack brewing, and here are the reasons why. And I didn't have access to any special information. I could just tell by, al-Qaeda tended to warn when it was doing attacks, and there were sort of warning signals from Bin Laden. There was also a lot of USG activity that, they were closing embassiys, and there were kind of alerts in the Arabian Peninsula, and it seemed that the government was of concern. So anyway, so all this amounted to me like there was something in the works. Now, what I didn't know. But yeah, I knew it was Bin Laden, because it's like the question is, when that kind of thing happens, who has the capability and who has the intent? Now, a lot of people may have the capability, but not the intent. So in fact, George W. Bush asked this question on the plane on 9/11 to Mike Morrell, who was a CIA briefer. I think it was at 10:40 a.m. He's like, who did this? Was it the Iraqis? Was it the Iranians? Morrell says, yeah, I don't think so. I mean, they've got a lot to lose. And in fact, I think it's Osama Bin Laden, and Mike Morrell was the same guy who briefed Bush on August the 6th at his branch in Texas, saying, this famous briefing, Bin Laden attempted to strike in the United States. So the point is, the agency, CIA, did a pretty good job of strategic warning. It happened.
And Bin Laden's initial, his strategic goal of 9/11 was to topple governments in the Middle East, because without American support, he thinks those governments will topple, caliphate, the Islamic rule law, and all these sorts of things, and ended up doing the opposite. And then, like any organization that needs to survive, he adapts. And he says, that was my end. A few years later, I think 3 years later, 4 years later, he says, well, no, my intention was to draw the Americans in, bleed them dry, bankrupt them. So he adapts, uses the platforms available to him at the time to do that. But what do you think about that adaptability and what his initial intent was, confusing tactics with strategy? It's just, what a mess when you look at the whole thing, what the intent was, and then you do the exact opposite.
Well, and the Japanese made the same mistake with Pearl Harbor. I mean, the Japanese, and I'm not an expert, but my understanding is the Japanese interpreted the United States kind of raucous democracy to be a sign of weakness, as opposed to a sign of strength. So 4 years later, the Imperial Japan's out of business. And so with Bin Laden, sort of the same thing. I think that he began to believe his own propaganda, which is kind of common thing. And he told us in '97 that the United States was weak. It's like the former Soviet Union. This was all completely crazy. And his strategic idea of getting us to pull out of the Middle East after an attack on Washington or New York made no sense. And then people within al-Qaeda told him it made no sense. But he didn't really listen to them. And one of the themes of the book, and it's interesting talking about the book, because you write the book, then you have to talk about it, two different aspects. And like, there's something I wish I'd be more clear in the book about some of these things. I think Bin Laden just really believed that what he believed was true. I mean, we all believe that to some degree, but Bin Laden didn't really take. But people said, this could backfire, or this could be against Islam, or this could be bad for the Taliban, this could be bad for al-Qaeda. He just completely tuned that out, and he kind of shopped around for people who agreed in al-Qaeda with him, and then he would listen to them. And in a way, it was kind of a textbook case of being a really bad leader, because he didn't take on new information that he disagreed with.
Yeah.
In the end, he achieved very, very little. He achieved nothing. And I think over time, already, one of the reasons I wrote the book, Jack, in fact, was I teach at Arizona State, and one of the bright students in my class, I realized she probably had just been born on 9/11, or maybe hadn't been born. She asked me, what's the difference between al-Qaeda and the Taliban? I was like, well, that's a really, really good question. There's a lot to unpack there. And then I realized, look, people joining the U.S. military, if you think about the 13 American servicewomen and American servicemen and women who were killed at Abbey Gate, Kabul airport, most of them were either not born or were babies on 9/11. Yeah. And so, this is an event that is now entered into history for younger people, and it's an event that exists in memory for people like myself that are older. But I thought it would be useful to kind of go back, and we know a lot more about Bin Laden today than we did even 10 years ago, because of the documents that your friends recovered, because of other stuff that's come out. And I thought it was a good time to sort of try to do a total assessment of this guy, because he changed history, changed American history, certainly changed the first 2 decades of our history, and then also changed the Middle East in all sorts of unexpected ways, that he didn't intend, but it happened. And so that kind of was the reasoning that I wrote the book. And thank you, by the way, for reading it so carefully.
Of course. Of course. I try to be. I always thought that it was my duty as a citizen and as an operator in the military and the SEAL teams to know my history so I could make the best decisions possible under fire, whether that was tactical or maybe eventually strategic or certainly operational in the middle there.
Which years were you on the SEAL team?
I got in 96. I came into the military. 97 was at Buds, our SEAL training, and then I retired in 2016. So I had a 20-year run
really
there. And the first, I was a glutton for punishment, but the first 6 years were enlisted. And so when the USS Cole was hit, when the East African embassy bombings happened, I was the intelligence representative for the platoon. And so I was always just a reader. My mom was a librarian growing up, so I was always surrounded by books, and I naturally gravitated to those that had themes about warfare, terrorism, insurgencies, that sort of thing. So I've really been a student of this my entire life. So I just think it's what we owe next generations, is to be as informed as possible so we can make the best decisions possible, whether that's in the voting booth or leading men down range. Either way, it's equally as important.
Well, and that's, Jim Mattis has said a version of that, because, obviously he is a big reader. I think he basically said, it's like, the reason I read is so I don't get a lot of people killed. I'm summarizing what he said. He said it in a more pithy way, but like something like why he did so much reading. And I was like, obviously you're not going to, every situation is different, but if you don't bring some knowledge of history to the situation, you're going to make more mistakes than if you just come into it completely blind.
Yeah, it's on that foundation from which to make better decisions going forward, hopefully with a little bit of wisdom. That's always the goal. But in this, you write something that was I wanted to read, and I think everyone needs to read this book because it encapsulates the last 20 years through the eyes of the man who actually changed history. You write, Bin Laden also offered no positive vision of the future other than the appeal of a caliphate that would somehow establish itself after the American defeat in the Middle East. There was no Bin Laden hospitals or soup kitchens. Meanwhile, Bin Laden's enemies list was extensive and included every Middle Eastern regime, Muslims who didn't share his views, the West in general, Jews and Christians. Making a world of enemies is never a winning strategy. As Sun Tzu once observed, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. That's just, I think that encapsulates what he accomplished by essentially going to war with anyone who didn't agree with him in a spectacular way.
It's the mistake Napoleon made, right? Napoleon, he could have, if he didn't, he made a world of enemies. And it's really the mistake ISIS made also, because ISIS antagonized every ethnic group in Iraq, and then, the United States, and then all of its allies. And you're not going to win if you make a world of enemies. And so I think, Bin Laden made that mistake. Napoleon made that mistake. ISIS made that mistake. And, eventually they're all going to ally your enemies.
Yeah.
And defeat you. And it's not impossible the Taliban will make this mistake again, because I think that, embedded in their DNA is some pretty bad judgment about the world. And, they may have, surely they've had time to reflect on some of their mistakes, but they could engage in ethnic cleansing in Afghanistan very easily. They could kill a dual national who's American. They could allow a jihadi group to train some Westerners on their territory, either through incompetence or through actual just allowing them. There's a lot. We should have this conversation, 3 or 4 years from now, because right now the Taliban are very, very good. They're militarily better shape than they were before 9/11, because they captured all our equipment. They have completely defeated what remained of the resistance. But, I think, things can't change. Obama changed his mind in Iraq, as you know, because of ethnic cleansing against the Yazidis, and because of the murder of Jim Foley by ISIS. And then a bunch of other countries allied with the United States. Remember, they burned the Jordanian pilot alive.
Oh, yeah.
So Middle Eastern countries joined the alliance, and suddenly ISIS, was 3 or 4 years later, and a lot of this happened under Obama, and it was finished under Trump. And ISIS lost its geographic caliphate. So ISIS and the Taliban, of course, there's a lot of differences, but there are some similarities. And I think that the Taliban, it's not impossible that they themselves could fracture because of disagreements internally. That could lead to a nasty civil war, which would not be a good thing. That actually might be even worse than the present situation, because that would be an even more conducive environment for jihadi groups. But we'll see what happens. I'm not convinced the Taliban are going to be there forever.
Well, I think before Kabul even fell a couple of months back, you made a prediction that, hey, I think what the Taliban wants, and I'm guessing that you saw provinces, cities, towns falling across Afghanistan, because before Kabul falls and before we see all those images on TV of the evacuation, you said, I think what the Taliban wants is to parade through the streets with American weapons vehicles. You said something to that effect in advance of everybody else saying, hey, look, the Taliban has American vehicles, American weapons, and they're parading through the streets of Kabul. So you came to that.
Yeah, and I thought it would happen, maybe on the 9/11 anniversary, and it happened quicker. As soon as Kunduz fell, I was on CNN. You don't want to make predictions on live TV that turn out to be total nonsense. But when Kunduz fell, I knew that a game was up, because it's the most important point between Kabul and Kandahar, the most important cities in Afghanistan, as you know. So once that city fell, and that was, the game was over, and so. There was a sort of discussion around during this time about, hey, this was an intelligence failure. And I don't think it was an intelligence failure. Actually, the intelligence community did a pretty good job of saying, this could go wrong very quickly. They said 30 to 90 days. It would turn out to be 11 days. Really it's an estimate. It's not a crystal ball prediction. But really, it was a policy failure, and I blame the Biden administration a lot for that policy failure. I blame the Trump administration a lot for that policy failure. After all, it was H.R. McMaster who described the peace agreement with the Taliban as a, quote, surrender agreement. And that, of course, he was out of office at the time. But so there's a lot of blame to go around, and historians will be studying what went wrong for a long time.
Yeah, I wish it would be more than historians and journalists. I wish it would be policymakers, senior level military leaders, people who are advising the president, politicians, these people who would crack a book every now and again, because we didn't have to go all the way back to Alexander the Great. We didn't have to go back to Genghis Khan. We had 3 British excursions in the 1800s, early 1900s. We had the Soviets. We had some history with which to kind of guide our decision-making process. And even our last 20 years in Afghanistan, we don't seem to have really learned from these different moments, in particular, it being part of the culture, like we mentioned earlier, to maybe, hey, change sides to the stronger warlord. If that makes sense, that's going to keep your head attached to your shoulders and keep your village from getting decimated.
One good thing is that in the National Defense Authorization Act, there is money for an independent commission, which is great. I mean, it wouldn't, there was a friend of mine, Joel Rayburn, led the Army history of Iraq, which is a very, serious history, and is not a typical military history, which is often we took, pill, it very practical.
Mm-hmm.
The Army history of Iraq is really the closest we're going to get to an official history of the Iraq War, because it is a real history. But what we need now is this is going to be an independent commission with people with real expertise to say, what are the lessons learned? Because I'm very suspicious of, the military is gearing itself up for this peer competition, which on some levels makes sense. I mean, certainly China. But what we keep getting, you mentioned, Vietnam, we keep getting dragged into these conflicts that are not what we want, because they're messy, protracted, inconclusive, guerrilla warfare, insurgencies. The U.S. military doesn't particularly want to do that.
Not very good at it.
But what's that?
They want to be very good at it. And it seems like these wars that we call irregular are much more regular than we would think.
Exactly. The irregular wars turn out to be pretty regular, and I think we make a big mistake about the sort of say it's all about peer competition. And by the way, if it's all about peer competition, why do we give up Bagram Air Base, which is in Afghanistan, which is very near China and very near Iran and very near Russia, and is, one of the, at one point had 50,000 American men and women serving there. And, we just kind of gave it away. So if we were serious about peer competition, it seems like Bagram Air Base would be part of that. And we on, so anyway,
there's a lot to unpack from the pages of history. And we don't even have to go back too far to closing our embassy the first time around in Afghanistan.
Well, that is such a
and then we
point,
do it again right now.
That is such a good point, which people forget, which is we closed our embassy in '89. And it's a very, I actually was I was just in Doha in Qatar, and I was on the stage with a very good friend of mine, Yanni Koskinas, who's a former JSOC Colonel Air Force, who worked with Stan McChrystal, and also with Saad Masseni, who runs Tolo TV, which is the main source of news. And I asked both of them, was it a mistake to close our embassy in Afghanistan? They both said yes. Because, at the end of the day, it's sort of like, part of it is we're going to have to engage with the Taliban to some degree, and it's better to do it in country. And it's not like they're, and we've closed our embassies before. We closed it in Sudan. In the mid-90s, we closed our embassy in Afghanistan in '89. And it's sort of like, it's a very natural thing to do, partly because of this force protection thing, which is like trumps every other concern. But at the end of the day, if you want to find out what's going on, we need to be there in some shape or form, and we're not. And maybe we'll open some kind of interest section in Afghanistan going forward. But we're really flying blind. It's all over the horizon. We're going to launch these attacks from Doha, from Qatar, where we have a big base, and it's like at least 1,000 miles away. As you know from working on SEAL teams, the fact that we took out, killed these 10 civilians thinking it was an ISIS-K vehicle in Kabul speaks for itself. And that was when we had sort of relatively real-time intelligence. We were still in the country, and we still made this mistake. Yeah. And so now we're not in the country, and 2 years down the road, whatever information you had, intelligence you had, is very perishable. It's going to be a different story. And sure, you still can carry out a drone strike, but who's going to tell you where, what's the information that's going to be reliable? That we can still have signals intelligence, which I think, obviously very useful, but I think it's useful only up to a point. And so I think this over the horizon kind of thing is, which is what the Biden administration talked about, I'm very unconvinced.
Yeah.
It's going to be the magic bullet.
And when you hear administration officials talking about this leverage that we have over the Taliban, what goes through your mind when you hear them use those terms?
Well, I always thought that was total BS. And because what if we had, we used to have a lot of leverage when we had Bagram Air Base, and when we had, we just kept giving the leverage away at the negotiating table. And then, when they were in power in the mid and late '90s, only 3 countries recognized them. They had UN sanctions, they had US sanctions. They survived just fine. Of course, they'd like international recognition. Of course, they'd like the $9 billion of Afghan government money that is in US banks. But that doesn't mean they can't survive without it. And one thing that I think people may not completely get is, there are 38 million Afghans. So we talk about these 124,000 are evacuated. So there's still 38 million in country. They can be taxed. They can be extorted. That's going to be the principles. That's their main kind of A, source of income. B, that's what they value. And so I think, they'd like international recognition. Yeah, they'd like, funding, and it's not like the international community is going to completely abandon them. UN will still be there. Doctors Without Borders will still be there, very honorably. A bunch of international aid organizations were there during the Taliban time, pre 9/11, in very difficult conditions. They won't leave the country because we're about to have this humanitarian disaster. I think 14 million people are in danger of starving this winter. So the internet, the international community, which is a phrase which is doesn't really mean much, it's so vague. But there'll be plenty of international organizations that stay, and rightly so. And it's possible the Chinese will recognize the Taliban first, and then the Pakistanis, maybe the Russians, maybe the Qataris, who are playing a very good role right now. But or they may not. So when we say we have leverage, if we have leverage, why do they appoint somebody who's on the leadership council of al-Qaeda as a minister in the cabinet?
Yep.
I mean, that doesn't say leverage to me. We have, we're obviously in touch with the Taliban. They are the de facto authority in charge. You can't ignore them. We do want to get Americans out that remain and all people who've helped us. And there's still, I think, a pretty large number. And dual nationals and green card holders and SIVs and P1 and P2 visa applicants. There's a bunch of people you want to get out. And now there's a much more regular, I was talking to Qatari officials just a lot, very recently. And, there's now really a system where there are relatively regular flights, although it's a drop in the bucket because you can take 200 people out on any given flight. And I think maybe there've been, 9 flights so far. So it's still, but there is a more regularized process. But I think the notion that we, the United States, have leverage over them is, I'm not sure. They haven't demonstrated that they do want things from us, but we're not going to give it to them. We, the United States, we're not going to recognize them in a million years.
Yeah.
By the way, one of the people I talked to in Doha is the UN guy who runs the al-Qaeda Taliban monitoring cell.
Wow.
And I'd read that 14 of the 33 cabinet picks in the Taliban were designated in some way by the United Nations as, and sanctions were on them. And he corrected me. He said there were 17. So more than 50% of the cabinet have sanctions by the UN. So, I mean, how do you, this is not a kind of conventional government that you can recognize. And so I don't see, maybe the Chinese, maybe the Pakistanis, but and that's it.
When we talk about strategic level blunders, and we talk about Bergen, we talk about embassies, we talk about having some historical precedent with which to make decisions. We have December of 2001, which you talk about in your book as being really a pivotal moment in our involvement in Afghanistan, because we have Bin Laden in Tora Bora. I think there are 70-ish special operators, CIA type covert paramilitary operators on the ground right there. There's 100 journalists. And then there are different Afghan factions that we are on our side because probably we're paying them at this point. We're the stronger warlord at this point in their eyes. But Bin Laden escapes into wherever he goes next. And the people on the ground are asking for reinforcements. They're asking for Marines who could have been sent in, 10th Mountain Division who could have been sent in to block that escape route out of an area that Bin Laden knew very well. And at the same time, we have George Bush being briefed on Iraq and a shift in focus before we have our 5-meter target Bin Laden, where we have him pinpointed there. So obviously that's going to be studied for quite some time and is a huge blunder. But from that time, from mid-December of 2001, and you touch on it briefly in the book because there's not that much information about where he goes from December of 2001 to is it 2005, 2006 when he ends up in Abbottabad. What in your research and what you know thus far, have you pieced together where his journey in those years?
Yeah. There is some information now, and it comes partly from the Pakistani government official kind of investigation that was leaked to alZarahiri in 2014, and partly from some other information, including from alZarahiri himself. So Bin Laden does something very smart at the Battle of Tora Bora. We now know he left on December 12, 2001, which is right as Tommy Franks is being briefed. Rumsfeld's being briefed by Tommy Franks about the Iraq war plan. So he disappears at 11 p.m. on December 12, 2001. Instead of going into Pakistan, which is what most people would expect him to do, he goes into Afghanistan deeper, and he goes into Kunar, which, as you know, is a heavily forested, very mountainous, excellent place to avoid detection from satellites, drones, whatever. He spends a year there. Then he goes to Peshawar across the border, big Pakistani city, spends very little time there, meets, I think, one of his wives there, two of his wives. Then he goes into Swat, which is a beautiful Switzerland-like area of Pakistan in 2002 to 2003. And then he goes to Haripur, which is a very obscure provincial city in northern Pakistan from 2003 to 2005. He has 4 kids, by the way, while he's on the run. His wife, his young Yemeni wife, has these 4 kids. When she goes to these hospitals in Pakistan, they present her as deaf and dumb, because why would a clearly Arab woman be having babies in these like obscure provincial cities in Pakistan? It wouldn't make much sense. So, but to avoid those, she pretends she's deaf and dumb. She has fake identification papers, and then he arrives in Abbottabad in October of 2005. He has there was a huge earthquake, you may recall, in Kashmir in October of 2005. And so there's a lot of chaos around that time, and the house has been built then, which is kind of good cover for new people moving in. And I think by the end of the year, the house is built, and he moves in, and he's there for 5.5 years before he's killed.
I mean, it's amazing that he moved all those times, and but it just goes to show that you can stay on the run, and we have plenty of examples of people doing that. And I want to be respectful of your time. I know I've already kept you over, but I'm so fascinated with your background and all the time you put into studying this. So as a couple more questions, if you have time, tell me about Gina Bennett at the State Department and the role she played in all of this, because it's so fascinating to me that someone who didn't even come into the State Department as an analyst to begin with, she's moved over fairly quickly when they recognize her potential. But her, and then how that moves into the sisterhood and the Bay and the Alex Station, and just how that all of evolves, really a grassroots type of a movement at the CIA and throughout the intelligence community.
Yeah, so Gina graduated from University of Virginia in 1988. A week later, she's at the State Department as a clerk typist. After 2 months, her boss says, basically, you're wasting your time here. I'll promote you. You can become an intelligence analyst. She does become so. Now she notices that the Cold War is over, so CIA is like their main enemy is gone. But she notices that there is kind of an unexpected result of the Cold War, which is these Afghan Arabs, and they're joining groups in Algeria and Bosnia and Chechnya, and they're getting involved in violence, and she's tracking them, and no one else really is. And she's very early 20s. Pan Am 103 blows up when she's, and that affects her, because a lot of the victims, 35 of the victims, were Syracuse University students who were not much older than her, and she's dealing with the families. And anyway, this all had a big impact on her. And so anti-terrorism became kind of her avocation, and she's still at the agency today. So her entire career has been at this, and she's probably going to retire next year. But so she began writing classified memos to people in the State Department about this guy Bin Laden in 93 and al-Qaeda. And in 95, she sets up a interagency task force of the few people who care about this, and they get together to talk about this issue. And eventually she moves over to the CIA. You mentioned Alex Station. So that started in early 96. It was mostly women led by Mike Scheuer, but there were women, Jennifer Matthews, who was killed by an al-Qaeda triple agent and host in 2000, many years after 9/11, and others. They were all very preoccupied with the Bin Laden threat. Of course, they were right. And on 9/11, Gina Bennett is pregnant with her 4th kid. She's discussing the assassination of Ahmad Shah Massoud as she's going into work. Something we've already discussed. They were trying to work out why that happened and what it meant. And the counter-terrorist center at CIA the CIA is evacuated except the counter-terrorist center. So they're the people who know the most about this. And so everybody stays at their desk, including Gina Bennett. Mike Scheuer volunteers to stay. He'd been sort of shuffled aside for reasons that he was essentially too anti-Bin Laden.
He got banished to the library, I think, or he used his time to continue his studies.
Well, he did it. He wrote what became a book about Bin Laden, but also became an 80-page briefing about Bin Laden that was very useful immediately after 9/11. Everybody was trying to work out what al-Qaeda was. So there was this group at the agency the CIA that really was focused on Bin Laden. There were also people at the White House who were concerned about him, Richard Clark and others, and then also people at the FBI field office in New York. John O'Neill, others, but the group of people who were focused on this before 9/11 was not large, and certainly before the embassy attacks in '98, it was tiny.
Yeah, you talk about it in the Manhunt documentary. It's fascinating. But there's a couple things that happened during that time frame when Alex Station has stood up, and you have these people that are focused on this threat. Maybe others aren't listening to them. As you said, Michael gets banished to the library at one point. But there are opportunities to take Bin Laden off the board, and there are people at the agency that are pushing for this, that are making the case for this. What would later become known as extraordinary rendition. There's an option that I don't think ever makes it to Bill Clinton's desk, but makes it almost to Bill Clinton's desk. And you had a lot of people at the agency trying to promote this, going into Afghanistan and getting him out early. Of course, there's the cruise missile strike in Sudan and on coast training camps, and the unintended consequences of that, which makes him Bin Laden a celebrity. There's Cole, where we don't respond, which also has an unintended consequence of reinforcing what Bin Laden already thinks of the United States as essentially a paper tiger when he thinks back to Beirut and looks at Somalia and these other examples that he points to. But these missed opportunities to take him off the board, what becomes of al-Qaeda if he is taken out in, say, like 1998? Does it dissolve? Does it?
Well, that's a great question. That's a great question. I mean, I think if he was captured or killed in '98, he would be 9/11 wouldn't have happened, because that was really his strategic. That it was his idea, and he selected the right people to do it. Unfortunately, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the operational commander of 9/11, had an idea like this, but he couldn't do it himself. They needed to recruit 19 suicide hijackers. They needed $500,000. They needed, a bunch of things that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed just didn't have access to. And so, might there have been other attacks in the United States by jihadists? Yes. There was already the first Trade Center attack, but would there have been anything on the scale of 9/11? I doubt it. Only Bin Laden had the kind of the organization and the ideas and the inclination, capability to do it. So I think I think it would have been different. And Mike Scheuer, who we've mentioned, he always said this guy's going to kill thousands of Americans one day, and unfortunately, he was correct. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's this memorandum of notification, and I got into this in my last book, The Devil's Hand, because I wanted to go into the history of the church hearings and different things that the CIA has done over the years. But in 1998, there's a really interesting thing that happens. I think it's on Christmas or Christmas Eve. This notification to kill Bin Laden. And it's still classified, but it's been seen by two commissions, I believe. The 9/11 Commission, some people have seen it, and then CIA Inspector General has seen it as well. And both of those came to different conclusions. I believe some at the White House thought that this is an actual notification that gives the agency the authority to go and remove Bin Laden from the board. But the CIA takes it as, oh no, we can capture him. So everything has to be around capture. And if in the process of that capture, something goes awry, then we can kill him. So it's very interesting that you have this big bureaucracy and these two different understandings of what this means, and we don't know because it's still classified. So we can't make our own determination, but we have two different semi-independent groups that have seen it and came to different conclusions on it.
Yeah, and I think you summarized the issue very well. And one, I quote Covert Black in the book, who was the head of the CIA counter-terrorism center on 9/11. He said, he actually spoke in it. There's a very good History Channel series, which I really recommend to anybody who wants the road to 9/11, which was it's probably a couple of years old now. It's 6 hours, and it's very thorough and well executed. I was a consultant to it, but that doesn't mean that
Right.
I should disclose that. But it's very well done. And Covert Black says, look, if Bill Clinton wanted to kill Osama Bin Laden, he should have just sent us a note saying, "Kill Bin Laden, signed President Bill Clinton."
Right. I read that. Yeah.
And I sort of feel like, okay, because the government is full of lawyers and they love legalese. It clearly was. The CIA interpreted it as being very ambiguous, and the White House felt that it wasn't ambiguous, and that somewhere in there the truth lies. And but certainly you mentioned the CIA Inspector General. when he filed the report, he talked to a lot of the people at the agency, and they all felt like that unless it was in the course of a real capture operation, they couldn't just go out and just arbitrarily kill him, which is strange because, of course, Bill Clinton did try and kill him with the cruise missile strike.
Right.
Those just didn't work. So anyway, but it's a what if. And then, President George W. Bush issues another memorandum of notification. I think it's on September 17th, and I haven't seen it. I think it's still classified, highly classified. But I think it's very unambiguous about not only killing Bin Laden, but anybody in al-Qaeda I don't know, a secret prison. It basically is allowed the agency a lot of leeway to do the things we know that it did.
Right, which is fascinating as well that you talk about in the book about the enhanced interrogations and black sites and drones, which you wrote another book on, and how from the Abbottabad documents, we know that is something that al-Qaeda as an organization, Bin Laden in particular, was very concerned about. But I know I've kept you over time, but last couple of questions as we're talking about al-Qaeda more generally. Is defeating an organization like al-Qaeda possible, or is the focus more on the management of that threat? Because what we're really talking about is destroying an ideology, destroying an idea. And you talk about this. My last thing I'll read from the book here, because I think everybody needs to go and buy this and read it. But you wrote that killing Bin Laden didn't kill his ideas, which lingered on among al-Qaeda's affiliates in Afghanistan, Iraq, North Africa, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. And they also lived on among Islamic militants around the globe, magnified by the internet, where Bin Laden remained an inspirational figure to every new generation of jihadists. And then going down here a little further, you say al-Qaeda was part of a fourth wave of religious terrorism driven by Islamist militancy that began in the 80s with the establishment of Ayatollah Khomeini's regime in Iran and with the arrival of the Afghan Arabs fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. This wave was likely to last longer than previous terrorism waves because it was, in the mind of the believers, sanctioned by God, and it's hard to abolish God. I think that's an incredible passage because it really, sums up what you're trying to do here when you declare a war on a tactic. How do you destroy an idea or an ideology?
Well, these ideologies can die out. Anarchism died out, Marxism, died out. They just die out of their own badness over time, and I think that is what's going to happen. But I think defeating them is defeat is a big verb. Management is, I think you can manage a threat so that it's not an issue, big national security issue. Trying to just end something completely, there's always going to be people in the idea with bad ideas, people in the world who are going to adopt these ideas for one reason or another. You can't destroy all of them. The resources involved would be too much. It's not even really that necessary. What you need to do is manage the problem so it doesn't become, a national security issue. And there's still, Marxists somewhere in the world, and it's not a national security issue for the United States anymore. So that, and of course, it's hard as a politician. It's hard to say, well, we're just going to manage this thing, so it's not it's much easier to say we're going to defeat it and it's going to be over. But I don't think it is going to be. Look, we've got another iteration of this in Afghanistan. We've already discussed with the Taliban. How that will shape out, we just don't really know. But we're not going to. It's important for us to focus on our defenses. So, and then it's important for us to have a relatively good offensive capability, whether that's special operations or special forces or drone warfare or cyber warfare. But I think if our goal is just to totally extirpate these groups and these ideologies, that's too much. And some of these groups don't really threaten us. Lashkar-e-Taiba, it's a big problem for India. It's not really that big a problem for the United States. Our goal can't be going out and finding everybody in the world who has these ideas and trying to either capture or kill them. It's not necessary.
We can also make the problem worse.
And it probably would make it's too resourceful. So, and we've done a pretty good job. Since 9/11, the United States has been, what we have is a domestic extremism problem with right-wing terrorists, jihadi terrorists, and there are people who are here. They're already here. It's like they're radicalizing here. They don't have to come into the country. So, and that is not an existential problem, but it's a problem. On 9/11, people came in. Basically, we've made it so much harder for people to get on planes. We have a whole apparatus, including who you work for, that was, it's done a pretty effective job of making this no longer
Yeah, the no-fly list, I
And
think
it's
before
really,
9/11, you talk about it's in the teens, and then it jumps up quite
yeah,
dramatically
yeah,
after that. And then the Tide list, which is something that I think a senator slipped up and told us how many people are on that list, which is secondary screenings a few years back.
right. So that's 1.5 million. So yeah, so Senator Feinstein, the number of people on the no-fly list is classified, and she slipped up and said it was 81,000. So on 9/11, it was 16. So I mean, there's like, and that's just one of
Mhm.
many. I mean, we have a multi-layered defense.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing. It's the offensive capability of special operations, SEALs, etc., and drones, cyber warfare, and defenses, TSA, DHS, National Counter-Terrorism Center, Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and we've got a lot of, it's a layered defense,
Mhm.
and it's very unlikely that anybody can get all the way through those layered defenses.
Yeah, I think there's a distinct possibility in sometimes making a problem worse. And I think we've done it a few times over the years. Hopefully, we've learned from those experiences. But
Yeah,
quickly before I let you go, what do you think Al Qaeda has learned from the last 20 years, in particular from Bin Laden's death? Did the organization, sometimes when a leader or somebody is killed in an organization, it can make it stronger because they learn from it. It doesn't seem like that's the case here, but I'm not sure. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. What did they take away
yeah.
from the last 20 years, in particular, Bin Laden's death?
Well, I mean, I think like the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria seems to have, whether they've learned or they've just adapted or whatever. I mean, they're more of a local jihadi group with some ability to control territory. We've seen that also with Al Qaeda in Yemen, although that's not the case so much today. We saw that with Al Shabaab in Somalia. I mean, these groups are basically, they kind of abandoned the let's attack the United States. It's like the costs of that are too high, or even attacking in the West in general. And they've gone back to, either because they've been forced to or because they realize it's smart, or both, just to attack the local enemies, whether that's the Assad regime in Syria or the Houthis in Yemen or whatever. So I think if they've learned anything, it's that attacking the United States is not smart, attacking the West is not smart. But ISIS didn't learn that lesson, and so not all these affiliates or spin-off groups have learned that lesson, but I think some have, and I mean the ones that have survived have been the ones that have really focused on the local conflicts. And Al Qaeda in Syria, which has gone by a variety of different names, it's a relatively strong group because it isn't engaged in anything that really Bin Laden was interested in, except because he keyed to the day he died, wanted attacks on the United States.
And never saw that really come to fruition.
Yeah.
So right now you're Center for the Future of War at Arizona State University. I mean, it sounds fantastic. If I was in college, I would never leave that department. But what are you doing there? What are you working on now? And then, as a follow-on, when you're doing those classes, or when you have a chance to talk to the next generation of military leaders, whether it's somebody, maybe it's an ROTC class or a West Point class or whatever it might be, or maybe people that are going into the agency, going into the State Department, future leaders, military strategists. What's your message to them based off what you've learned over the last 30 years or all your years of experience? What do you hope that they take forward as leaders of the next generation?
Well, I don't. I mean, I don't like try and sort of tell people how they should be, or how. I mean, I do think the study of history is useful. You mentioned history sometimes rhymes. Quoting Mark Twain. I think I think a deep some understanding of history is absolutely necessary for any of the things you just mentioned. And in my own life, I mean, I just like, if I'm talking about my career, it's like it's been a series of happenstances, and there was no master plan. But history has a way of intervening often. Like 9/11 changed a lot of people's lives.
Oh yeah.
Um, and in all sorts of different ways. And COVID has changed our lives in all sorts of ways. And I think an understanding of history does allow you perhaps to be, I don't know. I studied history at university, so I'm inclined to think it's a useful
Yes,
activity.
I believe so. I mean, I concur.
And I think that. But I don't really have some sort of overall master narrative to when I'm talking to my students. I am not. I don't believe. I grew up as a Catholic. I don't believe that that the world is always heading in the right direction. That the history has a direction and it's always going towards a better future. I base that. I have a kind of slightly more tragic view of history. Bad things happen, and I think if there's a lesson of history, is that bad things happen and will continue to happen, and that human nature is kind of a pretty stable for both for good and for ill. And it, look at, I mean, can you think of a group of, if you go back to 8 years, Facebook was going to be the kind of promised land and social media was going to like make the world a better place. Well, all of that turned out to be untrue. And social media companies, and maybe it's like the pendulum swung back too far. But any kind of technological advance, whether it's the railways or social media, is going to have good effects and bad effects, because human nature is very stable and can do both good and bad with whatever the technology is available. So if I had a overall message, that would be my general message, which is what I've learned, I think, from history, which is, it is tempting to kind of, I think, particularly if you're American, and I'm talking from Washington, D.C., I was born in America, my kids are American, my wife's American, spent a long time in England when I was a kid. But, I think Americans tend to want to, and maybe it's less so true today, but I think Americans want to, there's a city on the hill and we're moving towards it. Well, I don't believe that. Not because I'm not an optimistic person, but because I think we're capable of making lots of mistakes. And that's just, an incompetence is a better explanation of all human activity than anything else.
Unfortunately, I think you may be right. And unfortunately, it looks like this, like social media and the promises that or the expectations and the hopes that we had for it 20 years ago, 10 years ago, have ended up doing the opposite, dividing us, making it a lot easier to not spend time in the pages of an important book, but instead to retweet something that's been tweeted by someone who also didn't put the time, energy, and effort into really understanding the nature of whatever the issue is that they're talking about. So thank you so much for writing this, writing all these other books. I mean, you might not think about it because you're so busy all the time, but it has contributed so much to our understanding of the world for people that are in the military, people that are in government service in different levels of different agencies. But you really have had a huge impact on an entire generation of warfighters, entire generation of intelligence people, and I want to thank you for doing that, and I want to thank you for spending so much time with me today. Sincerely, it's been such an honor to be able to talk to you.
Thank you for reading these books, and thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
So,
and really quickly, what is next? Is there are you going to take a breath after writing this and reflecting on everything else that you've done to be able to write this book? What's next?
I'm taking a breath. I'm taking a breath.
Another wise decision. Amazing. Well, thank you so much again for being here, and take care and keep it up. I'll be following along. Welcome to the gear highlights section of the Danger Close podcast, brought to you by Schnee's Boots. Now, I've been using Schnee's Boots for a little over a decade, I think. And as you can tell, if you're watching this on YouTube, there's some miles on these. I've used them in Alaska, in Utah, in Colorado, and Montana, absolutely love these boots. If you followed me for a while, you've heard me talk about them before, seen me wearing them in some pictures. And these guys right here, these are the granites. And these are the first ones that I got. And they fitted me at either Safari Club International or Dallas Safari Club, and just fell in love with these boots. There's no middleman with these guys. So they're made in a factory in Italy. And that allows you to get a lot more for your boot, a lot more for your money, a lot more boot for your money. That's what I'm going for right there, because there's nobody else in that supply chain. Italy to Schnee's in Montana to you. And you can always call them anytime. Hey, I'm going on this kind of a hunt. What kind of a boot do you recommend? Because they have a lot of boots out there. I think I have 8 to 10, and my wife has a couple as well. But these granites have been a constant companion. These are the same ones that I got all those years ago. Absolutely love these boots. And then these guys right here, I think these are called the Hunter 2s, and love these, insulated and snow muck, slush. Just absolutely love these boots. These are some of my favorites right here. These get daily wear. I think these are called the Montanas, but I just got a new pair that just came in the other day. But these guys I've been wearing for, I think, 2 or 3 years now. And this is daily wear. You can tell there's a bunch of dirt on there that's dried now that it's springtime here, but wear these pretty much all winter. Love these boots right here. And then these guys, these are the Hunter pull-ons. And since we moved to the new house, then these guys have been I've worn these every day throughout the winter because the snow is a little deeper out here where we are right now. So I wore these pretty much every day throughout the winter. Absolutely love these things. So Sinead, thank you so much for all these years of amazing boots, and check them out online, Sinead's, and they have a bunch of other great stuff on there. Visit them in Bozeman, give them a call, talk to them about your needs for your particular hunt, and they'll point you in the right direction. Awesome. And then I'm going to read this so I don't mess it up right here. So when you shop there at schnees.com and you spell that SCHNEES.com, make sure you use the promo code JACK21, JACK 21, and then you'll save 10% off a pair of Sinead's boots and logo wear. So definitely do that. JACK21. And these handmade boots, they do sell out very quickly. So grab yours today. Take care of your feet. Don't compromise. Upgrade to Sinead's. And once again, that is SCHNEES.com and promo code JACK21. Well, because I had Peter Bergen on, whose new book, The Rise and Fall of Osama Bin Laden, is out now, and you should definitely read. It's absolutely fascinating looking back for him on the last few decades of work in terrorism, specifically studying Osama bin Laden, having talked to him in an interview that he did in 1997. Anyway, fascinating. Definitely get this book. Read it as soon as you can so we can get a better understanding of al-Qaeda, where it's been, where it's going, and how we can better address it going forward. So, bam, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden. And because of that, I thought I would just share a couple of these. So this is a blade that I got back in Afghanistan. So pretty cool. Just figured because I was just talking to Peter Bergen for so long about Afghanistan and al-Qaeda that it'd be good to share those. So anyway, pretty cool to have these memories from back then. What else? All right. MAKAI_metal_works. Check these out. Bam. So you can find that on Instagram and you can reach out and look at this. That's just a mean looking blade right there. So super cool. Navy veteran and awesome guy, super interesting guy. And he's out there making these sweet looking blades. And check this out. Oh yeah. Let's open this up. This just arrived. Oh yeah. Oh, it's pretty mean looking too. So thank you so much. Sincerely appreciate it. That is awesome. I mean, that's just a mean looking piece of metal. And if we're going to be playing around with blades, Adaptive X, which is a part of Dynamis Alliance, run by my buddy Dom Rasso. And this is the Slash kit. So toss this in a pocket, whatever else, throw in a tourniquet with it. But Slash kit, super small. You can tell that is just super tiny. You can throw it anywhere and very useful to have around. So Dom, Adaptive X, Dynamis Alliance, thank you so much. Be prepared. Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by 6 Hour. You can find out more about Peter Bergen at peterbergen.com. You can follow him on Twitter at peterbergencnn, and you can get his latest book, The Rise and Fall of Osama bin Laden, right now, anywhere books are sold. And I encourage you to go back and read everything else that he has written as well. You can follow me at Jack Carr USA on the social channels. You can go to officialjackcarr.com for the blog, find out more about the books, link to the merchandise site, which is Jack Carr USA. And if you like what you heard or watched, be sure to leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care. Stay safe. Keep fighting.